I've been working with the Lubicon since around 1989, and I'm really happy that Deborah invited us to present. I wrote a book called Lubicon Lake Nation, Indigenous Knowledge and Power. They have experienced rapid development. They didn't even have a road into their community until 1980. They were still living off the land. They got pretty much missed by the whole missionizing movement because they were so far in the interior of northern Alberta. So I'm going to go over all of that. We have a little film that I put together to demonstrate the devastation to their land due to logging, the Diashawa pulp mill, as well as, you all know, the tar sands. In the meantime, the Lubicon do not have a reserve. So in Canada, they don't have the status cards, they don't have any of those rights that most of us do have now. They're still struggling for those rights, as they have been since 1899. It's one of Canada's longest running land struggles and well recognized at the United Nations, which found Canada in violation of Lubicon human rights. So they still lived off the land when many of us were sent to residential schools. As I said, they didn't even have a road into their community because they're in interior of Alberta. So when they went through with Treaty 8 in 1899, they missed many of the interior Cree. And by missing them, that meant they didn't get a reserve, or they didn't get their security of a land base, and they also didn't get the security of the rights that would come with that. So in 1940, they went out to try to pursue, again, they didn't speak English, and they were getting around either through a horse and buggy or on the rivers. So they didn't have roads. That's pretty much, they're not isolated, they're connected, but they didn't have vehicles. And many of them were born on the land. So people my age and younger were born out on trap lines, and Cree is their first language. So the chief was one of the first in his community to speak English. They wanted him to speak English to try to secure their land base. Unfortunately, around 1940, they found out that there was oil there. And just as they were about to give them their reserve, secure their land, they found out about the oil. When they found out about the oil, everything literally shut down. So they never did get their reserve. In fact, they bulldozed their trap lines and their cabins to make way for development. So it took about 40 years for them to get to the development stage. So this was recent with the fire at Slave Lake. Some of the riverways that you're gonna see, I filmed it from an aerial. We used to drink out of that creek, and that's when I was up there doing research in 1990. You can't tell that that's even water anymore. And I also traveled to the Amazon to look at conservation of both Indigenous knowledge and land rights. And I found a resounding similarity, and I show some of those images later on. A lot of these roads used to be their trap lines, and the oil companies and the logging companies went in there and they put up signs saying no trespassing to people who have been there for thousands of years. So the treatment of the Lubicon has been recognized by the United Nations, and Canada has been found in violation of their human rights. It's one of the only cases any Indigenous group from Canada won at the UN. It didn't do much to change them. Understanding that these are people who lived off the land. We may have had 200 or 300 years as Haudenosaunee to adjust to contact and modernization. They have had rapid development, meaning they've had this kind of development happening in 50 years. So they've had to adjust from living off the land to a wage economy. And of course, because they're not a reserve and there's not employment in that area, they're really struggling. So this was an interview I did up at Fish Lake in 1990. This is a sacred site to the Lubicon. It's where they get all their medicines and where their ceremonies are. When they went in with logging companies in and around 1990, they asked the government to just stay out of the size of Great Britain. They asked the government to just stay off this little area where they pick all their medicines and it's sacred. Spirits live there. Where do you think the logging companies went first? To the very area they designated and asked them to stay out of. So what I was witnessing was psychological, emotional, and spiritual warfare. In some senses, eco-terrorism. The kinds of ways that they were encroaching on the Lubicon were done with a conscious attempt to demoralize them, and the idea was that they would give up, and they would go and sign up with other bands and basically cease to exist. You can see how young I am there. That was, again, 1990s. The women, the logging company that was in one of their territories caught on fire. During that time, 13 men were charged with arson. There was a trial going on, and the women were getting organized to take over because their husbands, brothers, and fathers were looking at up to 20 to 40 years in prison. Even though the month earlier, a young man had died. He had been seen with some loggers. They found him in a river, close to the river. The family waited for 2 days for RCMP to get up there, and they knew it was murder, and they wanted it investigated. They waited 2 days. Peace River is only like an hour and a half away from them. Yet, when a skid in a logging camp that was, nobody there was burnt, there was over 40 police cruisers in a community of 500, literally house to house, taking people in. So they've experienced a lot of very recent trauma. This was 2012. It was an oil leak, and it wasn't even covered by mainstream media. So you didn't see it on the news. It was one of Alberta's biggest leaks. And again, this is an area that was pristine only 10 years ago. Pristine. You could literally drink the water. And it's never going to come back. This is the waterway. It's the boreal forest. And one of the things that I noticed when I was doing this aerial shot is when I was in Brazil, they had a very similar river basin that they're quite attached to. So for some reason, Canadians and Americans care a whole lot about what's going on in the rainforest, but they don't seem to put that same framework in place or discourse or narrative when it comes to Indigenous people who are living off the land in North America. And I always want people to question why. Why is that? So over 70% of the tar sands are on their traditional territories. The pipelines crisscrossing, according to them, like cancer and steroids. The provincial announcement in 1988 of the Diashawa pulp mill near Peace River granted 11,000 square miles of land, including 4,000 square miles that was identified in their original claim. It all started in 1899. I discussed this a little bit with you. So they were aware of trying to get their land security. They didn't have school in their community until 1954. In 1939, they were recognized as a distinct Indigenous society with land rights. A reserve size was agreed to and set aside, but as World War II happened, it intervened in the surveys. 1954, the province, federal government was going to proceed with the agreed upon Lubicon Reserve, but then the federal officials found out about the oil and they stopped the establishment of the reserve. In 1971, they began to build an all-weather road from Peace River into their traditional lands and began to facilitate resource extraction at large-scale levels. The all-weather road was completed into unceded territory, and the commencement of a massive resource exploitation began by literally dozens and dozens of oil companies. The Lubicons went to court asking that their rights be affirmed and that they retain unceded Aboriginal land rights and that they were to get financial compensation. Over 400 oil wells were drilled within a 15-mile radius. Moose killed for food dropped from over 200 a year to 19. Income from trapping drops an average of over $5,000 a year to under $400 a year. Then the dependence on welfare began to soar, and we all know what happens when people lose their way of life. The Lubicon applied to the courts for injunctions to freeze resource exploitation on unceded lands, but the judges that were overseeing the court case had worked for the oil companies. 1983, a fact-finding mission by the World Council of Churches concludes that the Alberta government and dozens of multinational oil companies have taken actions that could have genocidal consequences. The United Nations Human Rights Committee agrees to hear the Lubicon complaint against Canada under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, concluding after 4 years of reviewing the evidence, the Lubicons could not achieve effective legal or political redress within Canada. The committee also instructed Canada to take interim measures of protection to avoid irreparable damage to the members of the Lubicon band. One of the things that I wrote about was, and I had met with the Minister of Indian Affairs, is that he was in charge of the Western Diversification Portfolio. So he's literally the Minister of Indian Affairs, but he's handing out over $60 million to foreign companies to come in and extract Lubicon resources. For example, Diashawa and other foreign companies, all under this Alberta's Western Diversification Portfolio. So you need to ask yourself, do you think that's a conflict of interest? More than 5 wells for every Lubicon person, and yet they're living below the poverty line. The territory that they relied on to hunt, fish, and trap is now crisscrossed by more than 2,400 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines. They're the first and only North American Indigenous UN decision found with Canada being in violation. There was another one that was again passed that the Lubicon were pressing the UN to hear their case and won. That was Article 27, so they actually have 2 cases before the UN. The Alberta government has acknowledging that it has brought vast wealth from the development of Lubicon land. In the midst of this wealth, the Lubicon live without running water. Today, more than 70% of the Lubicon territory has been leased for future resource development, including oil sands and extraction. I'm going to skip over that. So this is another oil spill that happened nearby. Actually, if you go on CBC interactive map of oil spills, it'll show you the amount of oil spills that have happened in the last 10 years. So while the TRC is emphasizing the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, Indigenous peoples, before proceeding with economic development projects, and the requirement of recognition and integration of Indigenous laws and legal traditions in negotiating an implementation process involving treaties, land claims, and other constructive agreements. While this may sound good to people in the South or people not engaged in this kind of reality, when you go to northern Alberta or some other places I visited, it seems like a shallow piece of paper because nothing has changed for them in over 100 years. So we'll see what happens. The most recent action, and this is where Cynthia and Bernard were going to take it originally, the plan from here was to discuss the most recent complaint in the 89th session, but also the recent submission dated May 2016 outline and assert systematic discrimination against them by the federal and provincial governments in the form of withholding services. They don't have like your basic health service. They have nothing. Like, it's incredible. They don't have a school. They don't have, I mean, what was built in 1954 is still there. It's really bad, almost unbelievably so. So withholding services, funding, and refusing to negotiate the long-standing, outstanding land rights issue. It's made international headlines, but the submission goes on to highlight the interference by the federal and provincial government officials into Lubicon governance. And with that, I don't know if some of you may have seen that there was an article saying that Bernard was a millionaire and he was living as a millionaire while his people were starving. They actually did a story, and what was upsetting to me was people actually believed it. I mean, they believed that this was really happening. So one of the things that they've done to get around the values that the traditional people hold to their lands is to hold elections outside of the community. And whether or not they're Lubicon, their votes counted. They had an election in Peace River. So that would be like during the reclamation in Caledonia, as if Caledonia was holding Six Nations elections. So then they go around the traditional governments. So we're hoping the TRC and recent activities, this is just some of the destruction to their lands. So while there's billions of dollars in oil coming off their lands, and this is what they're going to be left with, they're living in sheer poverty. No running water, no facilities, no employment opportunities, no reserve. And I'll just leave you with Summer Joe, who gave Bernard and the leadership, the Elders Council, that they were to continue no matter what, because the land is their life.